Jacob Burckhardt, a Swiss writer that wrote Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy in 1860. He was the first to coin the Renaissance as a period of rebirth. Hanseatic League, a commercial and defensive league of many merchant guilds and their market towns that were made up of many German states against trade that prevented a lot of commerce for a time. The Medici, a banking family of Florence that controlled much power in the city-state. They helped patron much of the arts and made Florence the center of the Renaissance. Baldassare Castiglione wrote Book of the Courtier, a standard for the Renaissance man that aimed to make a man achieve a well-rounded life through the arts. It also gave some advice on women, asking them to be chaste. Francisco Sforza, the founder of the Sforza dynasty in Milan, he was able to hold his country. He was a moderate patron of the arts. Florence, the center of the Renaissance, it was a cultural breeding ground and patronied many people of the arts. It was also a flourishing city in trade. Venice, a city that was centered around trade and dominated in power. Papal states, the religious states that helped patron the arts. It was centered around the Pope's power. Naples, a kingdom that did not have much power. They were not a real patron of the Renaissance. Federico Da Montefeltro, one of the most successful condottieri in Urbino. He was a humanist and civil leader. He made a great library that were centered around his books. He patronated the arts greatly and made it able to rise in power during the Renaissance. Battista Sforza, wife of Montefeltro that received a humanist education and was first in Greek and Latin. Isabella d'Este was one of the leading women in the Renaissance as a political and cultural figure that was a patron of the arts, regent of Mantua and prolific writer. She patronated the arts. Peace of Lodi, treaty between Milan and Venice that ended the War of Succession to Milan in favor of Sforza that balanced the power between Venice, Milan, Naples, Florence and the Papal States. Sack of Rome, 1527. Spanish armies of Charles I brought a temporary end to the Italian wars that allowed for the Spaniards to dominate Italy. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote The Prince that described that the acquisition and expansion of political power as the means to restore and maintain order. It was secular and said the ends justified the means. Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI that used ruthless measures to achieve his goal of carving a new state in Italy. He abandoned morality for political activity. Humanism, an intellectual movement based on the study of the classical literary works of Greece and Rome. They studied the liberal arts and antiquity. They were largely secular. Petrarch, the father of humanism. He was the first to say that the Middle Ages were a period of darkness. It set him searching for Latin books that put an emphasis on classical Latin such as that of Cicero. Civic humanism, Florence's humanist movement that was tied to civic spirit and pride in that country. Lorenzo Valla, educated in both Latin and Greek that made him write the elegances of the Latin language to purify medieval Latin and restore Latin to its proper position over the vernacular. He accepted only the Latin language of the last century of the Roman Republic and first of their empire. Neoplatoism, the rebirth in interest in Plato that was advocated by the translator Ficino. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, one of the most famous pieces of writing of the Renaissance called the Oration on the Dignity of Man. He combined the works of many philosophers that were all part of God's revelation to humanity. He believed in unlimited human potential. Laura Zaretta, educated in Latin by her father, she defended women to be scholars. She wrote a series of letters defending this. Johannes Gutenberg made the Gutenberg Bible, which was the first true book of the West to be produced by the movable type. Sandro Botticelli, had an interest in Greek and Roman mythology as seen with Primavera. It has well-defined figures with an otherworldly quality that is not quite realism. Donato di Donatello spent his time in Rome copying Greek and Roman statues. His statue David shows the triumph and strength of Florence over Milan. It had simplicity and strength that reflected the dignity of man. Filippo Brunelleschi, a friend of Donatello that drew inspiration from architecture of ancient Rome that built Church of San Lorenzo. He created church environments that did not overwhelm the worshipper but comforted them in human, not divine measurements. Leonardo da Vinci, transitional figure to the High Renaissance that carried on experimenting and even dissecting human bodies. He advanced the idealization of nature from natural to ideal form. It uses space and perspective to show people as three-dimensional. Raphael, he was acclaimed for Madonnas that achieved an ideal beauty beyond human standards. He painted frescoes in the Vatican and displayed balance, harmony, and order. Michelangelo, an accomplished painter, sculptor, and architect that was influenced by Neoplatonism. His muscular figure shows an ideal being that shows divine nature. Jan van Eyck, the first to use oil paint that allowed a range of colors and fine details. He did not have a true grasp of perspective though. He used empirical observation of reality. Albrecht Dürer understood laws of perspective and proportion, adoration of the Magi brow details to the art as well as ideal form. Guillaume Dufay changed the music of the Mass, used secular tunes to replace Gregorian chants as the fixed melody. He composed a number of secular songs. Charles VII established a royal army composed of cavalry and archers. He received from the Estates General the right to levy the taille without any further approval of them. It meant less power for the Estates General. Taille, an annual direct tax on land or property. Louis XI, the spotter king that retained the taille as a permanent tax imposed by royal authority. Louis secured a sound source of income. He could not repress the French nobility though. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy that attempted to create a middle kingdom between France and Germany. Louis opposed his action and Charles was killed in battle. Louis took his lands and started to develop a strong French monarchy. Henry VII, the first Tudor king that worked to reduce internal dissension and establish a strong monarchy. He ended private wars of the nobility by abolishing the practice that aristocrats maintained private armies of followers dedicated to the service of their lord. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Maximilian I attempted to centralize the administration by creating new institutions common to the entire empire. Opposition from German princes doomed this. However, he arranged his son to marry of Isabella and Ferdinand. Charles created heir to all three lines. Matthias Corvinus broke the power of wealthy lords and created a well-organized bureaucracy. He patronized humanism and brought Italian scholars and artists to bring to Hungary. John Wycliffe, disgust with clerical corruption led him to far-ranging attack on papal authority and medieval Christian beliefs and practices, alleged that there was no basis in scripture for papal claims and advocated popes to be stripped of their power. He attracted followers called Lollards. John Hus urged the elimination of the worldliness and corruption of the clergy and attacked the excessive power of the papacy within the Catholic Church. Hus was condemned as a heretic that led to revolutionary upheaval. Pope Julius II, most involved in war and politics, called the warrior pope, personally led armies against his enemies, much to the disgust of pious Christians. Pope Alexander VI, a member of the Borgia family that was known for his sensuality, he encouraged his son Caesar to carve out a central Italian territory out of the Papal States, creating a scandal. Pope Leo X, patron of Renaissance culture, accelerated the construction of St. Peter's. Northern Humanism focused on sources of early Christianity, the Holy Scriptures and the writings of Church Fathers. They discovered a simple religion. They believed that the teaching of this could bring inner piety that would reform the Church and society. This brought supportive education. Desiderius Erasmus. Thomas More. Martin Luther. He believed that salvation through faith alone in promises of God. This became from the primary Protestant Reformatio. Luther arrived from this as the sole authority of the Bible. 95 Theses. A statement that criticized that the sale of indulgences was not just. It was originally just to spark debate and not a break with the Church. Peasants' War. Peasant dissatisfaction in Germany stemmed from several sources. Many peasants had not been touched by economic improvement. Social discontent became tangled with religion, seeking for Luther's support, but he did not. Charles V. Holy Roman Emperor that ruled over an empire consisting of Spain and its overseas possessions, Austrian Habsburg lands, Bohemia, Hungary, the Low Countries and the Kingdom of Naples. He could not control his empire. Habsburg-Valois Wars. Rivalry between Charles V and Valois, King of France, Francis I, that became in conflict after disputed territory in southern France, the Netherlands, the Rhineland, northern Spain and Italy. Suleiman the Magnificent defeated and killed King Louis of Hungary, Charles V's brother-in-law. They overran most of Hungary and into Austria. Schmalkaldic League. 8 Lutheran princes and 11 imperial cities feared a defensive alliance against Charles V's threat of turning them back to the Catholic Church. They vowed to help only another. Peace of Augsburg. The division between Christianity was formally established. Lutheranism granted equal legal standing with Catholicism. Each German ruler could choose the religion for their subjects. Anabaptists. Went to simple living, believed that the Lord's Supper was interpreted as a remembrance, a meal of fellowship celebrated in the evening in private houses. They believed in adult baptism and complete separation of church and state. Ulrich Zwingli. Swiss reformer that spread RTHE Reformation. Relics and images were abolished. Paintings and decorations were removed from the churches and replaced by whitewashed walls. The Mass was replaced by reading of the Bible. Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife Catherine of Aragon. He cut off all appeals from English church courts to Rome. He abolished Pope authority in England. Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Cromwell, King's principal secretary that advised annulment of marriage. Act of Supremacy, 1534. The king was the only supreme head of the Church of England. They could control doctrine, appointments, and discipline. Treason Act. Punishable by death to deny that the king was the supreme head of the Church. Edward VI. Underage and sickly king that passed power to the Council of the Regency. They moved England to be more Protestant and instituted rights of clergy to marry, elimination of images and the creation of a revised Protestant liturgy in the Book of Common Prayer. Mary I. Catholic who intended to restore England back. She burned more than 300 heretics that actually made England more Protestant. John Calvin, the founder of Calvinism that wrote the Institutes of Christian Religion that adhere to justification of faith alone. Predestination. God had predestined some people to be saved and some to be damned. One had to openly profess faith, participate in baptism and communion and live a godly life. One couldn't be absolutely certain about this though. Geneva. John Calvin set up a ministry that brought a church constitution that used clergy and laymen for church as well as a code enforcing discipline. John Knox. Scottish reformer that helped spread the Calvinist thought throughout Europe. Catholic Reformation. Mixture of old and new elements. Medieval Catholicism revived with mysticism through tight experiences as well as monasticism was brought in. Society of Jesus. Jesuits became the chief instrument for the Catholic Reformation that submitted to will of the Church. They emphasized that human will can be strengthened by the Church. They believed in strong hierarchy as well as education of the masses. Ignatius of Loyola experiences spiritual torment similar to Luther but turned to Catholic Church. He wrote the Spiritual Exercises as a training manual for spiritual development by exercises that helped follow the will of God. Pope Paul III included himself in politics and patronized the arts. He appointed a reform commission and helped create papal reform. Paul IV. He increased Inquisition so even liberals were silent. He created the Index of Forbidden Books that was ungodly for Catholics to read. Council of Trent upheld traditional Catholic teachings in opposition to Protestant beliefs. Huguenots. French Calvinists that made up to 50% of the nobility, including the House of Bourbon, which was a threat to monarchical power. Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre. When reconciliation was believed between Valois king and Bourbon ruler, the French family were persuaded that Huguenots were a threat and sent a wave of violence that gripped the city. Catherine de Medici. A powerful woman who used her young sons as puppets to control the throne. Henry IV. A Protestant that changed to Catholicism for France to ascend the throne. Edict of Nantes. Acknowledged Catholicism as the official religion of France but guaranteed Huguenots could worship in select areas and receive fortified towns as well as political privileges. Philip II. King of Spain that ushered into greatness by use of the Spanish Inquisition. He made trade important as well as the importance of Catholicism. William of Orange wished to unify all 17 provinces of Netherlands after a revolt but later was split to the north and south. He led the South Protestant Union as a Dutch republic. Elizabeth I. settled religion that used active uniformity that restored service to Book of Common Prayer as well as active supremacy. She also used caution in her foreign policy. Mary, Queen of Scots. Next in line to the English throne, who was Catholic, she was placed on house arrest and later executed. Puritans. Those who were in the Anglican Church who wanted to remove any trace of Catholicism from their church. Spanish Armada. An attempt to get rid of a Protestant monarch in England in place of a Catholic one miserably failed by being caught in a storm and brought Europe to naval power. Prince Henry the Navigator founded a school for navigation in Portugal. This caused Portuguese fleets to probe around the coast of West Africa for gold. It brought back slaves from the Senegal River and gold on the southern coast of the hump of West Africa. Bartholomew Dias took advantage of westerly winds in South Atlantic to try to round the Cape of Good Hope but feared mutiny and went back. Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape with his crew and stopped at several ports controlled by Muslim merchants along the coast of East Africa, crossed the Arabian Sea and reached the port of Calicut and brought back ginger and cinnamon. Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer that worked with the Queen of Spain. He believed Asia was larger than previously thought and thought he could reach it by sailing west. He sent 3 ships and landed on the Bahamas, believing he had reached Asia. He converted natives to Christianity. John Cabot made a British claim of Canada that was the first British explorer. Treaty of Tordesillas split the land claims between the Spanish and the Portuguese. Spain got most of Latin American and the Portuguese got the Cape of Good Hope. Hernan Cortés arrived at the capital of the Aztecs and was greeted by Moctezuma. He believed that he was a god and gave him gold, but eventually he took him hostage and pillaged the city. The disease they brought killed many of the Aztecs and led for the Spanish to take over. Francisco Pizarro had steel weapons, gunpowder and horses that were unfamiliar to the Incan Empire. They already were ravaged by smallpox. The emperor died because of it and his two sons claimed the throne, which caused a civil war. He captured the capital and took it for the Spanish. Encomienda, a system that permitted the conquering Spaniards to collect tribute from the natives and use them as laborers. In turn, the holders were supposed to protect them, pay them and supervise their spiritual needs. Many took advantage of this and treated them poorly. Bartolomé de las Casas participated in the conquest of Cuba and received land and natives. He underwent radical transformation and came to believe that the natives were treated poorly. He became a Dominican friar and fought for their rights. He wrote the Tears of the Indians. Boers, Dutch farmers that began to settle in areas outside the city of Cape Town. King Alfonso from the Congo became concerned about the impact of slave trade in his society. Robert Clive, an aggressive British empire builder who eventually became the chief representative of the East India Company. He consolidated British control in Bengal, would later lead to colonies being made there. East India Company expanded their authority for an economic decision that made regular revenue to pay for military operations in India. Dutch East India Company, Dutch trade of spices near the East India. Jacob Fugger, head of one of the wealthiest banking firms in Amsterdam that eventually went bankrupt. Antwerp, the older commercial and banking center replaced by Amsterdam. Mercantilism. Duratus Mercator, a cartographer that created a world map that was based on new projections of the New World. 30 Years' War. Last of the religious wars between militant Catholicism and Calvinism. Ferdinand II, elected the Holy Roman Emperor, refused to accept that he would be disposed by rebels, defeated Frederick and Bohemian nobles and came back into power. Christian IV, King of Denmark that was a Lutheran that intervened by leading an army into northern Germany. He was defeated by Wallenstein and ended Danish supremacy in the Baltic. Maximilian of Bavaria took the rest of the territory that the Spanish took. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden that revived Sweden and made it a Baltic power. He brought disciplined and well-equipped Swedish army to northern Germany. He was a devout Lutheran and was killed in battle. It led to southern Germany to remain Catholic. Wallenstein, a Bohemian noble that took advantage of Ferdinand's victory over Frederick and defeated the Dutch. He was assassinated but would bring victory for southern Germany. Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, made it clear that religion and politics were separate. It also made Calvinists, Protestants or Catholic kings decide the religion of their people. Louis XIII, a young king that passed his power down to the many cardinals at the time. Jacques Bossuet wrote politics drawn from the very words of Holy Scripture that argued government was divinely ordained so that humans could live in an organized society. God established kings and through them reigned over all the peoples of the world. Their authority was absolute. Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIV, the supreme power of France that was an absolute power. He was willing to pay the price of being a strong ruler and created an absolute monarchy. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Versailles, a palace that was the household of the king, the location of central governmental machinery and where powerful subjects found themselves. He used it as a way to keep powerful people out of politics. Edict of Fontainebleau. Revoked the Edict of Nantes. Marquis of Laviosse. Secretary of War that led France to develop a professional army numbering 100,000 men in peacetime and 400,000 in time of war. Triple Alliance 1667. Dutch, English and Swedes that forced Louis to sue for peace by invading the Spanish Netherlands and forced him to accept a few towns there. League of Augsburg. Spain, Holy Roman Emperor, the United Provinces, Sweden and England added to his third war that brought famine to France. War of the Spanish Succession. Brought to arms about who was to get the throne of Spain. Charles II left his throne to the grandson of Louis VIV, but when he, Philip V, became ruler, Europe brought up arms in an attempt to maintain a balance of power. Peace of Utrecht, 1713. Philip III. Interested in court luxury and relics, he allowed his first minister to run his country. Philip IV. Chief Minister Guzman dominated his moves to revive the interest of the monarch. They curtailed the power of the church and aristocracy as well as a political reform program whose purpose was to further centralize the government of all of Spain and its possessions. This did not do much though. Frederick William the Great Elector. Frederick I. Granted the title King of Prussia. Leopold I. Peter the Great encountered the West and had determination to westernize Russia. He wanted to transplant technology to Russia by reorganizing the army as well as the central government, split Russia into provinces. Table of ranks. Created opportunities for nobles to serve the state and join the nobility due to system of ranks. Great Northern War. Peters was with the Danes and gained a warm water port that would be the window of the West and the capital of Russia. Charles XII. Interested in military affairs in Sweden that would involve them in wars, he lost much of his land to Russia, making Sweden's power short-lived. Suleiman the Magnificent brought the Turks back to Europe's attention. He extended their power into the western Mediterranean and threatened to turn it into a Turkish lake. Battle of Lepanto. When the Mediterranean was threatened, the Turks were defeated by the Spanish that brought them to norm control of that area. William III of Orange established a monarchy in Dutch Republic but then went back to a republic as it once was. James I. Son of Mary Queen of Scots that became King of England, understood little about the laws, institutions and customs of the English, believed in divine right of kings that alienated the Parliament. Puritans were opposing of the policy of the king. Charles I. Long Parliament. Took a series of steps to limit authority of the royal government. There were to be no arbitrary courts, the abolition of taxes that the king had collected without their consent, and the Triennial Act that said they were to meet at least every 3 years. English Civil War. King tried to take advantage of split between radicals and moderates and arrested some radicals. He arrested Puritans and started the English Civil War. Oliver Cromwell made the new model army that was made of Puritans that believed they were fighting for the Lord. He became a leader after the death of the king. He made a military dictatorship. Rump Parliament. Presbyterians of the Parliament were purged, leaving 53 Puritans by Cromwell that tried and condemned the king. They executed him. Charles II. Returned to England. The restoration of the monarchy still made Parliament have much power, and its necessity for its consent to taxation was accepted. Arbitrary courts were still abolished. James II. Devout Catholic that attempted to further Catholicism in England and name them in high positions. He made it able for Catholics to become powerful in office. Test Act 1673. Charles II's Parliament said that only Anglicans could hold military and civil offices. Declaration of Indulgence, 1687. Suspended all laws barring Catholics and dissenters from office. Glorious Revolution. William of Orange and Mary were invited to invade England. With almost no bloodshed, there were acts of new king and queen to prevent Catholic power. William and Mary raised an army and invaded England while James, his wife and son fled to France. They accepted a Declaration of Rights and Parliament's authority. Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan that claimed that the state of nature was terrible. They were guided by animalistic instincts and self-preservation. They said that a commonwealth with absolute authority should be the most powerful. It should strike fear in the citizens. John Locke wrote 2 treatises of government that said humans lived in equality in the state of nature. They made government to protect their rights while people would act reasonably. If the government broke this, people could form a new government. Mannerism brought anxiety, uncertainty, and suffering to painting. It broke down principles of balance, harmony, and moderation. They distorted rules of proportion with elongated figures. El Greco painted elongated and contorted figures in unusual shades that created emotion. Baroque. They brought classical ideals with spiritual feelings with dramatic effects that would be used to arouse emotions. It reflected search for power. Bernini. Action, profusion, and dramatic effects mark his style. He made ecstasy of Saint Teresa that would show mysticism. Gentileschi. A female artist that was the first woman to be elected to the Florentine Academy of Design. She painted heroines from the Old Testament. French Classicism. Committed to values of the Renaissance, it created clarity, balance, and simplicity that was a version of the High Renaissance style. Its triumph reflected chaos to order. Rembrandt. Dutch painter that painted opulent portraits and grand, colorful scenes. He lost public interest by doing his own style and died bankrupt. Shakespeare. A playwright that wrote through mastery of the English language as well as the codifying of the language. He knew human psychology and wrote about human condition. He brought both upper and lower classes to his plays. Racine wrote Greek-styled tragedies that focused on conflicts such as Phaedra. Molière wrote comedies that ridiculed religious hypocrisy and social issues. Wrote Tartuffe. Nicolaus Copernicus. Heliocentric. A system that put the sun in the center of the solar system with the Earth revolving around it with other planets. It brought the human view to feel more small to the universe around them. Ptolemaic System. A system that put the Earth in the center of the solar system with the sun and heavenly bodies around it. It made humans seem like the masters and controllers of the universe. Tycho Brahe built a castle with a library, observatories, and instruments that he designed for astronomic study. He compiled a record of his observations that disproved the Ptolemaic system, but he refused to accept the Earth moved. Johannes Kepler. Galileo Galilei. Isaac Newton. Paracelsus rejected the work of Aristotle and Galen and attacked universities. He followed a chemical philosophy that a human was a small replica of the larger world. He used chemical remedies that went for each sickness. He is associated with diagnosis and treatment of disease. Andreas Vesalius wrote on the fabric of the human body that deviated from traditional practice by dissecting a body to illustrate the individual organs and structure of the human body. William Harvey wrote on the motion of heart and blood that demonstrated the heart was the beginning point of the circulation in the blood in the body, and same blood flows in both veins and arteries, and blood makes a complete circuit throughout the body. Margaret Cavendish. Encouraged by her husband to pursue scientific works, she wrote plays and autobiography and a biography of her husband. She was excluded from the Royal Society, wrote observations upon experimental philosophy and grounds of natural philosophy that attacked that humans could be masters of nature. Maria Sibylla Merian. Maria Winkelmann. Educated by her father and uncle and received training in astronomy, she married Kirk of Germany and assisted him in Berlin Academy of Science. She was denied the post as assistant astronomer in the Berlin Academy though. René Descartes. He believed that he would only accept things that his reason said was true. He separated mind and matter that created Cartesian dualism. Mathematics would help humans understand the world around them. Believed in deductive methods. Francis Bacon wrote The Great Instauration that created inductive science. He went from particular to general for practical reasons. He was not a scientist, but he wanted science to be logical. Benedict Spinoza wrote Ethics demonstrated in the geometrical manner that believed that humans were part of God. The lack of understanding of God led to bad things, so people should love him to gain their ends. Human emotions should be analyzed. Blaise Pascal, French scientist who made calculation machine and devised probability. He assured inventors that Christianity was the only one to see man as vulnerable and great. God was a reasonable bet. The English Royal Society created a committee to investigate technological improvements for industry. The French Royal Academy of the Sciences created a committee to collect tools and machines. Bernard de Fontanelle. Direct link between scientific revolution and enlightenment. He was the secretary of the French Royal Academy. He communicated scientific knowledge in a clear way that appealed to the upper classes. Wrote plurality of words based on a woman talking to her friend about new cosmology. Pierre Bayle. Tabula rasa. Locke's belief that every human is born with a blank mind. People were molded by their environment and subject to influence. By change the environment and influence, society would be changed. This could be achieved through Newton's reason. Philosophers. French term. Literary people, professors, journalists, statesmen, economists, political scientists, and social reformers from nobility and middle class. Paris was their capital and affected the Western world. Rational criticism should be applied to everything, subject to state censoring. Montesquieu. Voltaire. Jean Collins. Denis Diderot condemned Christianity as fanatical. He said that it was the worst religion. Wrote the encyclopedia that attacked superstition and toleration as well as improvements spread to the masses when it was lowered in price. David Hume. Scottish philosopher that wrote treatise on human nature that argued that observation and reflection grounded in common sense made a science of man. François Quesnay. A physiocrat that said natural economic laws governed society. Wealth could increase by agriculture alone because all other activities were unproductive. The state revenue should come from a single tax as well as natural supply and demand. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations that condemned mercantilist use of tariffs to protect home industries, believed that labor was true wealth of a nation as well as the government should leave the economy alone and only be used for army, police and public works. Paul de Holbach wrote System of Nature that argued that everything in the universe consisted of matter in motions. Humans were machines and God was a product of the human mind. He had uncompromising atheism. Marie Jean de Condorcet wrote the progress of the human mind that showed humans 1 through 9 stages of history and knew we're entering to the 10th stage of perfection. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Mary Estelle wrote serious proposal to the ladies that said women were to be better educated. She also argued for the equality of the sexes in marriage. Mary Wollstonecraft, founder of modern feminism, wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women that pointed at the contradictions of the point of view of women. The subjection of women were wrong. Women had same rights as men. Salons. Elegant drawing rooms in the urban houses where invited philosophers and hosts gathered and engaged in conversations. Marie-Thérèse de Joffrin. Widow had welcomed the encyclopedists to her salon and offered financial assistance to them. Marquise de Defend invited great figures such as Montesquieu, Hume and Voltaire and was rival with Joffrin. Rococo. Grace in gentle action that had fondness for curves and natural objects such as seashells and flowers, made designs interlaced in gold. Neoclassical. French movement that wanted to recapture the dignity and simplicity of the classical style of ancient Greece and Rome. Jacques-Louis David. Neoclassical painter who used moral seriousness and honor and patriotism. Bach composed Mass in B minor, St. Matthew's Passion and cantatas and monnets, believed music was worship to God. Handel wrote songs for large audiences that wrote 40 operas and secular music. However, he is most known for Messiah. Haydn composed 104 symphonies as well as string quartets, concerti, songs, oratorios and masses, wrote Creation and Seasons for the common people. Mozart, child prodigy who wrote Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni and the Magic Flute. It has grace, precision and emotion. Samuel Richardson wrote Pamela that shows a servant Thhat does not cave into seduction. The master reads her letters and sees that she has a good mind and heart and marries her, appeals to cult of sensitivity. Henry Fielding wrote The History of Tom Jones about the adventures of a young scoundrel that is a comedy about English society. Edward Gibbon wrote Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire that believed that ideas of progress and Christianity led to the fate of the Romans. Cesar Beccaria wrote on Symes and punishments that was opposed to capital punishment, turned towards cells and they people subject to discipline. Barber surgeons. They had a dual occupation that served to bleed patients and perform surgery in bad conditions. They soon diverged and studied bodies and patients. Carnival. A time of excess in a festival that was celebrated before Lent. Consumption of food and sexual activity were commonplace. It was time to drink in excess. Toleration patent, 1781. Joseph II of Austria said that Catholic had public practice and granted Lutherans, Calvinists and Greek Orthodox the right to worship privately. Zinzendorf focused on personal experience with God that constituted religious experience. He opposed rational form of religion. John Wesley, Anglican minister that experienced a mystical experience. Wesley preached to the masses and organized people into Methodism that became another sect of Christianity. Enlightened absolutism. Absolute monarchies that gave freedom of speech and press, the right to hold private property, fostering the arts, sciences and education. They must obey laws and enforce them equally on all subjects. Natural rights. Rights that were inalterable privileges that ought not to be withheld from anyone. This included equality before the law, freedom of religious worship, freedom of speech and press and the right to assemble, hold property and seek happiness. Louis XV lazy and weak ruler that allowed ministers and mistresses to influence him, control the affairs of state and undermine the prestige of the monarchy. He lost the overseas empire in the 7 Years' War and gave burdensome taxes. Cardinal Fleury, Louis XIV's minister that caused France to pull back from foreign adventures while commerce and trade expanded and the government promoted the growth of industry. Robert Walpole, relied on by King George II as Prime Minister. They were allowed to handle Parliament and dispense patronage that led to modern-day Great Britain, pursued peaceful foreign policy. John Wilkes, journalists who openly criticized the king's ministers. He was arrested and then released but expelled from his seat in Parliament. When he won another seat, he was denied a place in Parliament again. He became a symbol for liberty and end to parliamentary privileges. Frederick William I promoted evolution of civil bureaucracy through creating the General Directory. It was the chief administrative agent of the central government, supervising police, military and economic and social affairs, made code of obedience, honor and service to the king. Junkers, nobility landed aristocracy of Prussia that owned large estates with many serfs that played a dominant role. They had monopoly of officers in the Prussia army. Frederick the Great, Maria Theresa, Joseph II, Catherine the Great. First eager to do reform that questioned serfdom, torture and capital punishments, divided Russia into 50 provinces. Local nobility became increasingly important. She favored the nobility. Charter of the Nobility gave nobles right of trial by peers and exemption from taxation and corporal punishment. Pugachev's Rebellion, peasant that won support by freeing all peasants from taxes and military service. He encouraged them to seize their landlords' estates and killed. The rebellion collapsed and serfdom expanded. Philip V. The laws, administrative institutions of the state and language of Castile were established in other Spanish kingdoms that made him truly King of Spain. Intendants were introduced. Charles III. The Catholic Church was brought under control when the king banished the Jesuits and circumscribed the activities of the Inquisition. Gustavus III reasserted the power of the monarchy in Sweden, established freedom of religion, speech and press and instituted a new code of justice that eliminated use of torture, reduced tariffs, abolished tolls and encourages trade and agriculture. Nobles were frightened by their loss of power and killed him. War of the Austrian Succession. 7 Years' War. Diplomatic Revolution. Assigning by Maria Theresa of new rivalries, Britain and France over colonies and Austria and Prussia over Silesia. France allied with Austria and Great Britain with Prussia. Agricultural Revolution. Increase in food production due to more farmland, increased yields per acre, healthier and more abundant livestock and an improved climate. It improved living conditions. Jethro Tull discovered that using a hoe to keep the soil loose allowed air and moisture to reach plants and enable them to grow better. He also used a drill to plant seeds in rows instead of scattering them. John Law tried to create a national bank for France and paper currency. People went overboard and drove stock extremely high and the bank went bankrupt. Domestic system. A system that was a family enterprise that applied traditional methods of manufacturing in homes. Merchant entrepreneurs bought raw materials to rural workers where they spun it. The entrepreneurs sold the product and used profits to manufacture more. Richard Arkwright invented the water frame powered by horse or water that turned yarn much faster than spinning looms that would later develop mechanized looms. Grand Tour A tour young aristocratic men went on at the end of their school career throughout Europe to study antiquity as well as art throughout Europe's biggest cities. Louis XVI. Under his reign, the nobility had continued to play a crucial role in French society. Nobles of the robe derived their status from office holding, often enabled commoners to become noble rank, dominated royal law courts and administration. Nobles of the sword. Descendants of original medieval nobility, they wanted to resist the monarchy and control positions in government, military and church. Tail. Attacks at the clergy and the Second Estate were exempt from as opposed to the Third Estate which paid all of the tail. Charles de Calonne, Controller of General Finances that proposed a complete revamping of the fiscal and administrative system of the state. He convened an assembly of notables to ask for support, but they refused. He was forced to call the Estates General. Estates General. French parliamentary body that was convened in order to gain consent to raise taxes to pay for the debit by the government. Cahiers de doléances. Statements of local grievances that were drafted throughout France during the elections to the Estates General advocated a regular constitutional government that would abolish the fiscal privileges of the church and the nobility. Abbacies. Wrote what is the Third Estate that says that it is everything. It hasn't been represented and wants to. This showed the view of changes within a framework in the respect of the king. National Assembly. When the First Estate refused to vote by hand, the Third Estate voted to create this and decided to draw up a constitution. Tennis court oath. The meeting place of the National Assembly was locked, so they moved to an indoor tennis court and swore to meet until they produced a constitution. Bastille. The Great Fear. A vast panic by agrarian people that feared invasion by foreign troops that were supported by the aristocracy that encouraged the formation of more citizens' militias and permanent committees. Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Olympe de Gouges. Playwright and pamphleteer that refused to accept the exclusion of women from political rights that wrote Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizen. Women's March to Versailles. Parisian women marched to demand bread from the king. They had starving children. Louis XVI promised grain supplies, but this did not end the protest. Lafayette ordered them to march, and now they ordered the family returned to Paris. The king also brought flour from the Paris stores. Assignats. Form of paper money that was issued based on the collateral of the newly nationalized church property. Civil constitution of the clergy. Bishops and priests of the Catholic Church were to be elected by the people and paid by the state. They were required to swear an oath to the civil constitution. The Pope forbade it, so only 54% took the oath. Constitution of 1791. Established a limited constitutional monarchy. There was still a monarch. Legislative Assembly. Assembly that the power of the king was vested in 1791, that was to sit for 2 years and consist of 745 representatives chosen by an indirect system of election that preserved power in the hands of the more affluent members of society. A distinction was drawn between active and passive citizens. Jacobins. Radical group that grew out of deputies. They occupied Paris and formally made groups and correspondence networks. There were 900 clubs in 1 year with Paris in the center. Declaration of Pillnitz. Leopold II of Austria and King Frederick II of Prussia invited other European monarchs to take the most effectual means to put the king back into power. However, the leaders were suspicious of one another that did not do much of anything. Flight of Rennes. The king was upset by the upheaval, so he tried to flee France to his wife's native land, Austria. He was captured at Valence and brought back to Paris. The moderates chose to ignore the king's flight and pretended that he had been kidnapped. Paris Commune. Sans-culottes. Ordinary patriots that were both the working people and poor, but also merchants and better-off artisans who were the elite of their neighborhoods and trades. National Convention. Girondins. Represented the provinces that feared radical mobs in Paris and were disposed to keep the king alive as a hedge for the future. Mountain. Represented the interests of the city of Paris and owed much of its strength to the radical and popular elements of the city. Although most of them were middle class, they won and condemned the king to death. Committee of Public Safety. In order to curb domestic crisis, the National Convention made this. They were organized to protect the Republic from internal enemies. Maximilien Robespierre. The leader of the Committee of Public Safety that governed France, he centralized the administration of France and helped expand the Reign of Terror. Reign of Terror. Killed royalists, former revolutionary Girondins and peasants. Many who opposed the sans-culottes were killed by guillotine. 16,000 were formally killed. The true number was near 50,000. Republic of Virtue. The belief of what would happen when all the internal enemies were purged. France would be a stronger nation. Society for the Revolutionary Republican Women. Composed of largely working-class women that were a family of sisters that were ready to defend France. However, many men believed they should not be in politics and instead at the home. Temple of Reason. Changed the Notre Dame Cathedral to this. It was a public ceremony dedicated to the worship of reason was held in air. Patriotic women paraded before the temple where the high altar once stood. Female personifying liberty rose from it. It created many more enemies than friends. Toussaint Louverture led 100,000 black slaves to rise in revolt and seize control of present-day Haiti and later was captured. He started and created the Haitian Republic, spreading French Revolution ideals abroad. Thermidorian reaction. The National Convention curtailed the Committee of Public Safety and shut down the Jacobin Club. Churches were allowed to reopen and the decree of 1795 let all be free to worship. Laissez-faire and moderation triumphed. Constitution of 1795. The Directory. The government that the Council of Elders elected from 5 electors presented by the Council of 500 to act as the executive authority. It was a materialistic reaction to the Reign of Terror. They had to contend with political enemies. Napoleon Bonaparte. Concordat of 1801. Civil Code of 1804. Peace of Amiens. Napoleon sought peace with Russia, Britain and Austria. He gained new land and number of light territories from the North Sea to the Adriatic. This did not last long though. The Grand Empire consisted of 3 parts: the French Empire, dependent states and allied states. He considered himself the leader of the whole. Napoleon demanded obedience to his will. He spread Enlightenment ideals. Battle of Trafalgar. Napoleon was defeated by the English Navy, one of his first of a series of defeats. Continental System. Napoleon attempted to prevent British goods from reaching the European continent in order to weaken Britain economically and destroy its capacity to wage war, but countries resisted and this failed as well. Invasion of Russia. Elba. Napoleon was exiled here first on the coast of Tuscany while the Bourbons were restored to France in Louis XVIII. Napoleon slipped away from here back to France. Waterloo. Napoleon met combined British and Prussian forces and suffered defeat. He was then exiled to tiny St. Helena. Richard Arkwright. made the water frame spinning machine that was powered by water or horse and increased cotton production. James Watt, asked to repair a Newcomen steam pump engine. Instead, he added a separate condenser and steam pump and transformed it into a steam engine. Power was derived from steam. It could pump water 3 times more quickly. Thomas Newcomen, an atmospheric engine developed in 1712 to pump water. Although it was better than horses lifting water from the mine, it was still largely inefficient. Henry Court developed a system called puddling in which coke was used to burn away impurities in pig iron to produce iron of high quality. George Stephenson made the rocket, which was used on the first public railway line in 1830, expanding 32 miles from Liverpool to Manchester at 16 miles per hour. Crystal Palace, a structure made entirely of glass and iron that was a tribute to British engineering. It was 19 acres and had 100,000 exhibits of items made during the Industrial Revolution. It was a symbol of success and how humans dominated over nature. Frederick List, Credit Mobilier, French joint stock company that helped take savings of small investors and brought shares for new industries. These investments were essential to industrialization. The Great Famine. While half of the population depended on the potato for survival, the potato crop in 1845 had struck blight due to a fungus. This caused for over 1 million to die of starvation and 2 million to move to the United States and Britain. Edwin Chadwick. Factory Act of 1833 strengthened earlier labor legislation. All textile factories were included, and children between 9 to 13 could work only 8 hours and 13 to 18 could work only 12. Combination Acts outlawed associations of workers. It, however, failed to prevent the formation of trade unions. Robert Owen. Luddites, skilled craftspeople in the Midlands and northern England who in 1812 attacked the machines that they believed threatened their livelihoods. These attacks failed to stop mechanization, but they had widespread support in the areas that they were present in. Trotskism. 10 Hours Act reduced the workday for children between 13 and 18 to 10 hours. Women were also included. Coal Mines Act eliminated the employment of boys under 10 and women in the mines. Congress of Vienna. Clemens von Metternich, Austrian foreign minister that was an experienced diplomat that was concerned about re-establishing peace and stability in Europe. He believed that legitimate monarchs were the only ones who could perceive traditional institutions. Edmund Burke. Concert of Europe. Quadruple Alliance. Great Britain, Austria, Prussia and Russia that agreed to stay united not only to defeat France but also to ensure peace after the war. They re-established the Bourbon monarchy to France through Louis XVIII and agreed to meet at a congress in Vienna. Protocol of Troppau meant that great powers had the right to send armies into countries where there was revolutions to restore legitimate monarchs to their thrones. Britain refused to agree and argued that the intention of the alliance was not to interfere in the internal affairs of other states except in France. Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. Most peaceful congress in which the 4 great powers agreed to withdraw from the occupation from France and add France to the concert of Europe, making a quintuple alliance. Congress of Laibach. In 1821, Austria, Prussia and Russia went behind Britain's backs and authorized the sending of Austrian troops to Naples that crushed the revolts there, restored Ferdinand I to the throne and then moved north to suppress the rebels in the Piedmont. Monroe Doctrine. guaranteed the rights of independence of the new Latin American nations and warning against any further European intervention. Greek Revolution. Peterloo Massacre. Mass protests of the Corn Laws took a turn when the cavalry charged into a crowd of 60,000 people that killed 11 people. The parliament restricted large public meetings and dissemination of pamphlets among the poor. Corn Law of 1815. A measure that placed extraordinarily high tariffs on foreign grain that was beneficial to landowners but made bread too high for the working class. Louis XVIII. Ultralists criticized the king's willingness to compromise and retain so many features of the Napoleonic era. They wanted to return to a monarch dominated by an aristocracy of privilege and bring the Catholic Church to as much status as it was before. Charles X. Frederick William III. Britschaffen. Carlsbad Decrees of 1819 closed the student societies, provided censorship of the press, and placed the universities under close supervision and control. Alexander I. Decembrist Revolt. Thomas Malthus. David Ricardo. John Stuart Mill. Utopian Socialism. Charles Fourier proposed the creation of small model communities called phalansteries that were self-contained. It had ideally 1,620 people that were communally housed and worked together for their mutual benefit. Work would rotate to relieve workers of undesirable tasks. Robert Owen. The British cotton manufacturer that believed humans would show their true kindness. He was successful in transforming a factory into a cooperative community. However, in New Harmony in Indiana, the bickering within destroyed his dream. Louis Blanc wrote The Organization of Work, in which he maintained that social problems could be solved by government assistance. He called for the establishment of workshops that would manufacture goods for public sale. The state would finance them, but the workers would own and operate them. Flora Tristan tried to synthesize feminism and socialism by traveling through France and preaching the freedom for women. The Workers' Union advocated the application of Fourier's ideas to reorganize family and work. French Revolution of 1830. The July Revolution, in which barricades went up in Paris as a provisional government led by a group of moderate liberals was hastily formed and appealed to Louis Philippe, the cousin of Charles X, to become the new constitutional monarch of France. Charles X fled to Britain. July Ordinances. Election of liberals in 1830 caused Charles X to issue the July Ordinances that imposed rigid censorship of the press, reduced the electorate in preparation for new elections, and dissolved the Legislative Assembly. Louis Philippe. Great Reform Bill of 1832. Poor Law of 1834. Anti-Corn Law League. Richard Cobden and John Bright, who formed it to help workers by lowering bread prices. Robert Peel, leader of the conservative Tories that persuaded some of his associates to support free trade principles and in the Corn Laws. He repealed the Corn Laws. Revolution of 1848, France. At Polders. Louis Philippe's government refused to make changes and opposition grew by radical Republicans and Socialists joined by the upper middle class agitated for the dismissal of the minister Guizot. Since they were forbidden to form rallies, they held banquets to call for reform. National workshops. The Second Republic. A unicameral House legislature of 750 elected by universal male suffrage for 3 years and a president also elected universally by males for 4 years. Louis Napoleon. Elected into the Second Republic as president as a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, he would soon become Emperor Napoleon. Frankford Assembly. Dominated by well-educated, middle-class delegates that were ahead of their times in nationalism, the assembly aroused controversy by saying they were a government for all of Germany. They made Little Germany without Austria and making the Prussian king emperor of the new German state. Frederick William IV refused the assembly's offer and ordered them home. Giuseppe Mazzini. Louis Maurice de Bellin, prefect of Paris, that made police officers called sergeants that were dressed in blue and a white cane. They were supposed to free traffic movement, maintain safety, clean streets, supervise and precaution against accidents and maintenance of order in public places. Bobbies. Romanticism tried to balance the use of reason by stressing the importance of intuition, feeling, emotion, and imagination as sources of knowing. They believed in inner drives and rebelling against middle-class conventions. They were passionate about the past, especially the medieval ages, worshipped nature. Goethe. Carlyle. The Romantic hero was celebrated as a genius ready to defy the world and sacrifice his life for a great cause. However, he did not make his heroes destroy themselves but transform society. He stressed that historical events were determined by such heroes. Walter Scott wrote Ivanhoe about the clash of Saxon and Norman knights in medieval England. Lord Byron dramatized himself as a melancholy romantic hero described in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. He participated in the Greek independence movement and died fighting the Ottomans. Percy Bysshe Shelley, expelled from school for advocating atheism, wrote Prometheus Unbound as a portrait of the revolt of human beings against the laws and customs that oppress them. William Wordsworth experienced mystical feelings from nature. Nature contained a mysterious force, in his opinion, that a poet could perceive and learn from. Nature could teach a person about themselves. It was alive and sacred. Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes with an interest that transcended natural details. He showed mystery and mysticism. Nature was manifestation of divine life. Delacroix, famous French romantic artist that was self-taught. He had a passion for color and expressed exoticism, combined theatricality and movement with use of color. Beethoven served as bridge from the classical to the romantic. He wrote Eroica that was originally intended for Napoleon that had many uncontrolled rhythms. It opens many emotions through music. Chateaubriand wrote Genius of Christianity that was seen as the Bible of Romanticism that defended Catholicism on romantic sentiment of emotions. Cathedrals brought the presence of God. It showed the revival of interest in the Catholic Church at the time. Marie Curie discovered that the element radium gave off rays of radiation that apparently came from within the atom itself. Atoms were not simply hard, material bodies but small worlds containing electrons and protons that were random and inexplicable. Max Planck rejected the belief that a heated body radiates energy in a steady stream but maintained that instead that energy is radiated discontinuously in irregular packets called quanta. Quantum theory raised questions about the subatomic realm of the atom. Albert Einstein Friedrich Nietzsche. Henry Bergson. Georges Sorel. Sigmund Freud. Social Darwinism. Application of Darwin's principle of organic evolution to social order. Herbert Spencer. Exponent of social Darwinism that argued that societies were organisms that evolved through time from a struggle with their environment. Progress came from the struggle as the fit societies gained. He explained in the book Social Statics many of these principles. Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Ernst Renan. French Catholic scholar that wrote Life of Jesus, questioned the historical accuracy of the Bible and presented a radically different picture of Jesus. He saw Jesus not as the Son of God but as a human being whose value lay in the example he provided by his life and teaching. Pope Pius IX took a rigid stand against modern ideas. He outright rejected modern ideals and forces. Syllabus of Errors. Written by Pope Pius IX that stated that he cannot agree with progress, liberalism and modernity. He condemned nationalism, socialism, religious toleration and freedom of the speech and press. Pope Leo XIII achieved compromise through the Catholic Church by teaching evolution as a hypothesis in Catholic schools and responded to modernization in economic and social spheres, recommended that Catholics form socialist parties and labor unions of their own to help workers. De Rerum Novarum. Salvation Army. Founded in London in 1865 by William Booth, it established food centers, shelters where the homeless could sleep and rescue homes for women. These served as a purpose to save not only the person but the soul from hell. Naturalism. Émile Zola. Leo Tolstoy. Fyodor Dostoevsky. Symbolists. Impressionism. A movement that originated in France in the 1870s when a group of artists rejected the studios and museums and went out into a countryside to paint nature directly. Camille Pissarro. One of the founders of Impressionism that believed that art should not be defined on outlines but involved brushstrokes in color to focus on nature. One would paint what they observe and feel. Claude Monet. Enchanted with water and painted many pictures that he sought to capture light, water and atmosphere as seen in impression, sunrise. Berthe Morisot broke the practice of women being only amateur artists and became a professional painter. Her dedication won her the disfavor of academics. She used light colors and flowing brushwork. Post-Impressionism arose in France and spread to other European countries. It kept emphasis on light and color but also paid attention to structure and form. They used color and line to express inner feelings and present a personal statement of reality. It was the start of modern art. Paul Cézanne. One of the most important post-impressionists, he rejected the impressionists and in paintings such as Women with Coffee Pot, he sought to express visually the underlying geometric structure and form of everything he painted. Vincent van Gogh. Tortured artist that believed art was spiritual. He was interested in color and believed that it could be used as a language to show what artists feel. Pablo Picasso. Extremely flexible artist that painted in many styles. His development of Cubism was also important. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was the first Cubist painting. Cubism used geometric designs as a visual stimuli to recreate reality in the viewer's mind. Wassily Kandinsky. abstract painter that worked in German that was one of the founders of the movement. In painting with white border, he sought to avoid representation altogether. Art should avoid any reference to visual reality and concentrate on color. Claude Debussy. His musical compositions were inspired by the visual arts, such as Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun that inspired a symbolist poet. He did not tell a story in music, the piece recreated in sound the feeling of the poem. Igor Stravinsky. One of the 20th century's most famous composers that gained international fame as a ballet composer and with Diaghilev revolutionized the ballets with Firebird, Petrushka and At the Rite of Spring. Millicent Fawcett organized a moderate group who believed that women must demonstrate that they would use political power responsibly if they wanted Parliament to give them the right to vote. Emmeline Pankhurst, along with her daughters, founded the Women's Social and Political Unions in 1903 that enrolled middle and upper-class women. They realized the value of the media. Suffragettes. Women that used unusual publicity stunts to call attention to their demands, such as pelting government officials with eggs, chaining themselves to lampposts, smashed windows of department stores, burned railroad cars and went on hunger strikes, had aimed to full citizenship in the nation-state. Maria Montessori. Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew that was captain in the French General Staff. A secret military court found him guilty of selling army secrets and condemned him to life in prison. Mobs yelled death to the Jews. Soon after, evidence showed him innocent and he was pardoned by the government of France. Christian socialists combined agitation for workers with a virulent anti-Semitism, most powerful in Vienna. Karl Lueger, leader of Christian socialists and mayor of Vienna, held German nationalism that blamed Jews for corruption of German culture. Hitler had this worldview due to this. Theodor Herzl, key figure in Zionism that published the Jewish State, in which he advocated for a Jewish state. Finances came from yeshivim, or settlement in Palestine by wealthy Jewish bankers. Zionism, a movement for a Jewish nation. They advocated to return to Palestine, the land of ancient Israel that had been the land of their dreams. National independence caught their attention. Fabian socialists stressed the need for the workers to use their right to vote to capture the House of Commons and pass legislation that would benefit the working class. They wanted evolutionary socialism. Labour Party, where British unions and Fabian socialists combined to form a party. They gained 29 members to the House of Commons by 1906. National Insurance Act of 1911 provided benefits for workers in case of sickness and unemployment to be paid for by compulsory contributions from workers, employers and the state. It provided pension for retirees over 70 and compensation for workers injured in the job. David Lloyd George, orator from Wales who had been moved by the misery of Welsh coal miners, increased taxes on the wealthy to pay for social reforms. William II, unstable and aggressive emperor that was inclined to tactless remarks as when he told soldiers they had to be prepared to shoot their mothers and fathers if they had to. Sergei Witt, Minister of Finances, sponsored the state's industrialism in Russia. He saw industrialism as essential to Russia's strength. He built railroads and encouraged protective tariffs. He believed in foreign capital. Revolution of 1905, started by peasants that went to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to present a petition of grievances to the Tsar. Russo-Japanese War, when a Baltic fleet was sent to Japan, only to be defeated, it brought shock to Europe. The Russians admitted defeat and sued for peace. Transportation broke down and food shortages were on the rise in major Russian cities. Bloody Sunday, when troops opened fire to a peaceful demonstration that killed hundreds. It incited workers to call strikes and form unions. Zemstvos demanded parliamentary government, ethnic groups revolted and peasants burned land of landowners. Peter Stolypin, Tsar's chief advisor that dissolved the village ownership of land and opened the door to private ownership by enterprising peasants. New imperialism. When European states embarked on an intense scramble for overseas territory in a revival of imperialism for Africa and Asia. White man's burden. The belief that the superiority of their civilization obligated Europeans to impose their practices such as industrialization and medicine to non-white people. Cecil Rhodes founded both diamond and gold companies that monopolized production of these precious commodities and enabled him to gain control of a territory north of Transvaal, conspired to overthrow the Boer government without British approval. Transvaal. The Vaal River, where the Boers were forced to migrate by hostilities between them and the British, continues. When the British governor of the Cape Colony seized the Transvaal, but a Boer revolt led the British government to recognize it as an independent nation. Boer War. Extremists from both sides initiated conflict. The Boers were overwhelmed by the British. The end caused Transvaal and the Orange Free State to have representative governments, as well as the Union of South Africa that was a self-governing dominion. David Livingstone, Scottish missionary that believed that he needed to convert many in Central Africa. King Leopold II, Belgian king that had rushed to pursue Africa. He treated Africans so brutally that many were appalled. He created the International Association for the Exploration and Civilization of Central Africa and engaged Henry Stanley to establish Belgian settlements in the Congo. British East India Company, private trading company that was responsible for subjugating much of India. After a revolt of sepoys caused the British to defeat them, London gained direct control of it. Open door policy. China was forced to agree to this policy, in which one country would not restrict the commerce of the others in its spheres of influence. Commodore Perry, American Navy commander who forced the Japanese to grant the United States trading and diplomatic privileges. Boxer Rebellion. Boxers, or Chinese that belonged to the Society of Harmonious Fists, whose aim was to push foreigners out of China. They murdered foreign missionaries, Chinese who converted, railroad workers, foreign businessmen, and the German envoy. Meiji Restoration. The restoration of the emperor as the rightful head of the government. The new leaders controlled the emperor, initiated a change in Japanese government. Indian National Congress. Moderate, educated Indians that were starting to seek self-government. When Britons were violent and insensitive, they demanded independence. Congress of Berlin, led by Bismarck, that demolished the Treaty of San Stefano. The Bulgarian state was reduced and the rest of the land was under Ottoman control. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania were recognized as independent. Bosnia and Herzegovina were placed under Austrian protection. Triple Alliance. When Russia was alienated by the Congress of Berlin, this alliance was made between Germany, Austria, and Italy to support existing political order while providing a defensive alliance against France. Three Emperors League. When Bismarck allied with traditionally conservative powers of Austria-Hungary and Russia, did not work well because of Austro-Russian rivalry in the Balkans. Reinsurance Treaty. Bismarck sought to preserve friendly terms with the Russian and signed this in hopes to prevent a French-Russian alliance that would threaten Germany on a two-front war. Admiral von Tirpitz, Secretary of the German Navy that worried the British since he constructed a large navy and a number of battleships. Entente Cordiale, where the British turned to their enemy friends and settled their colonial disputes. First Moroccan Crisis, where Germans chose to oppose French designs on Morocco in order to humiliate them and drive a wedge between the two new allies. It only succeeded in unifying Britain, France, Russia, and the United States against Germany. Triple Entente, loose association of Russia, France, and Great Britain that grew rigid as the Balkans were heating up. Bosnian Crisis, First Balkan War. When Europeans' attention returned to the Balkans in 1912, where Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro and Greece organized the Balkan League and defeated the Ottomans. Second Balkan War. When the Allies were unable to agree on how to divide the conquered Ottoman provinces of Macedonia and Albania, Greece, Serbia, Romania and the Ottomans attacked and defeated Bulgaria. Bulgaria obtained only a small part of Macedonia and the rest was divided between Serbia and Greece. Francis Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne that was assassinated in Sarajevo, that precipitated the confrontation between Austria and Serbia. Militarism. When large mass armies grew after 1900, this caused conscription. Machines used for the military doubled in size. The influence of military leaders grew that drew up complex plans for mobilizing men and supplies in case of war. Pan-Slavism. The idea that the black-handed hopes of to create a nationalistic Slavic kingdom with Serbia and Austria. WWI. The war that was intended to be local but grew larger and larger due to nationalistic tendencies and alliances. Schlieffen Plan. Germany could not solely raise its army against Russia, so they declared war on France after issuing an ultimatum to Belgium declaring the right for them to pass through. Battle of the Marne. General von Hindenburg, the leader that was defeated as a commanding general, created military dictators and decreed a system of complete mobilization. General Ludendorff, chief of staff for Hindenburg, that made Russia no longer a threat to Germany. Moltke, modification of the German attack plan in the West and his inability to retain control of his rapidly advancing army significantly contributed to the halt of the German offensive on the Marne. Verdun, one of the largest and longest battles of the war that resulted in around 750,000 dead, with one of the costliest battles in human history. Lusitania, where the German government declared the area around the British Isles a war zone and threatened to torpedo those that were in it. 100 Americans lost their lives on this passenger liner that suspended the act against the area. Total war affected the lives of all citizens no matter where they were. It transformed and centralized powers and regimentation. Easter Rebellion, when members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Citizens' Army occupied government building in Dublin that forced Britain to crush it and condemn them to death. Defense of the Rome Act allowed the public authorities to arrest dissenters as traitors, that was later extended to authorize public officials to censor newspapers by deleting objectionable material and suspend newspaper publication. March Revolution. At the start of March, a series of strikes broke out in Russia due to the government increasing food rations after the price of bread skyrocketed. Petrograd, the capital city that was formerly St. Petersburg, where women protested on March 8, shouting peace and bread and down with the autocracy. Lenin, leader of the Bolsheviks, he was dedicated to the violent revolution that would destroy the capitalist system. He spent most of his time in Switzerland but went back to Russia when he saw the opportunity for power. Bolsheviks, small group of Russian social democrats who saw value in socialism, needed to control people to overthrow the provisional government. Redistribution of land to peasants and factories to the Soviets. Peace, land bread, worker control of production, all power to the Soviets. Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia that was forced to abdicate after the 1905 revolution. Army Order No. 1. Order for all Russian military forces that encouraged them to remove their officers and replace them with committees of elected representatives of the lower ranks of the army that caused chaos. Bolshevik Revolution. When Kerensky released Bolsheviks from prison and turned to the Petrograd Soviet for help, numbers of Soviets raced to 240,000. Leon Trotsky, revolutionary and chairman of the Petrograd Soviet that took over the city. The government collapsed. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Signed a treaty with Germany that gave up eastern Poland, Ukraine, Finland and the Baltic provinces to try to keep peace. Russian Civil War. When the Bolshevik army was fighting many fronts that came from Siberia, Ukraine and others, they gained Ukraine back as well as Georgia, Russia, Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Tsar was murdered as well as his family. Woodrow Wilson. Treaty of Versailles. Georges Clemenceau. French leader that was determined to punish Germany for humiliation of the French Empire. He renounced desire for a separate Rhineland and instead a defensive alliance with Britain and the United States. League of Nations. Aimed to prevent future wars that Wilson agreed to make compromises